Mistress thought she won until millionaire husband's pregnant wife took everything. Secrets are the quiet architects of life, behind the stately townhouses of Manhattan's Upper East Side. In a realm where lavish charity galas shimmer with society's brightest smiles, the darker truths often remain hidden in plain sight until a single indiscretion explodes into scandal. This tale begins with a wealthy couple bound by ambition and love, yet threatened by greed and lust. Their fortress of loyalty shatters when a cunning mistress steps onto the stage, determined to seize riches she believes are her due. But even the most brilliant schemer can be outplayed, especially when the wife proves she's not so easily cast aside. In the storied corridors of Manhattan's Upper East Side, specifically along East 73rd Street, stood a limestone townhouse that had witnessed its share of whispered intrigues and quiet dramas. The property, first built in 1910, was once a testament to the opulence of America's Gilded Age. Over the decades, owners came and went, leaving their marks in lavish renovations that merged the townhouse's old-world grandeur with modern amenities. Its interior boasted crystal chandeliers, hand-picked from Paris flea markets, Italian marble floors that gleamed under soft lighting, and sweeping staircases that curled like ribbons, leading to elegantly furnished rooms above. From the outside, passers-by could only marvel at the stone facade, the ornate ironwork on the balcony, and the tall windows reminiscent of a bygone era of architectural flourish. The caretaker, an older man named Gregson, prided himself on maintaining the property's timeless splendor. He remembered each of the previous owners, especially those who had thrown glamorous parties where champagne never ceased to flow. But none had soared to such dizzying financial heights or fallen to such depths of scandal as the Davenport family. Inside lived Richard Davenport, a man who seemed plucked from a modern-day Horatio Alger story. Born into a family of modest means in Rhode Island, he attended public schools before blazing his way into the Ivy League. With an MBA from Harvard Business School in hand, he moved to New York City in his 20s, hungry for the promise of wealth and influence. He made his name on Wall Street by founding Davenport Equity Management, a hedge fund that swiftly amassed billions in assets under management. By his mid-30s, whispers of his financial acumen floated from the pages of the Wall Street Journal to the gatherings of the city's social elite. Alongside Richard was Helen Davenport, his wife, who had grown up in Queens. While Richard's background might have been more privileged than Helen's, her upbringing was shaped by daily reality's subway rides to a cramped classroom, part-time jobs to support her dream of studying art in college. When they first met at a mutual friend's birthday party in Boston, she was an aspiring watercolor artist finishing an art education program. He was already forging connections with major venture capitalists. Their marriage, after a whirlwind romance, symbolized both love and a merging of two distinct worlds. Helen brought unassuming warmth and earnest kindness to his life, offsetting his fiery ambition. He credited her for his steadiness. He often said that while his world was money, hers was heart. Over the years, the Davenports' townhouse became a hub for philanthropic gatherings, many of them focusing on art education, Helen's passion. With each event, the couple's image was strengthened in society pages as not just wealthy, but benevolent. Yet behind the closed doors of that stately mansion, reality could be both more ordinary and more turbulent. Marital tiffs, business stress, hopes for children, unspoken resentments, and a deep ache in Helen whenever she felt overshadowed by her husband's unstoppable career machine. What neither of them fully realized was how quickly a single temptation could crack the fragile veneer of their world. For all the talk of trust, the introduction of another woman's ambition would launch a series of betrayals, blackmails, and cunning maneuvers that no one in the glitzy world of Manhattan's high society would soon forget. Their story was about to take a tragic, exhilarating turn the moment Cindy Marlowe, beautiful, clever, and dangerously driven, chose to set her sights on Richard Davenport. And in that pursuit, Cindy would discover that the greatest danger in illusions of winning lay in underestimating the quiet power of the woman by his side. Before any storms brewed, Helen spent her days in the townhouse's light-filled art studio on the top floor. Morning sunlight streamed through tall windows, bathing her canvases and brushes in a halo of warmth. She would paint scenes of daily life: children at play in Central Park, sunsets over the Hudson River, and occasionally delicate portraits that captured the unspoken emotions flickering across her subjects' faces. Her hands, stained with paint, represented her contentment. This was the existence she'd always dreamed of, balanced by philanthropy and occasional teaching stints at local arts charities. Helen's early years shaped her generosity. Growing up in a cramped apartment shared with two siblings, she learned how to make the best of limited resources. While her mother cooked modest meals, her father spent most of his time working double shifts as a taxi driver, hoping to afford a better life for his kids. From them, Helen inherited resilience and empathy. She refused to let opulence blind her to other people's struggles. It was this empathy that anchored Helen whenever Richard's business soared to new heights. He often retreated behind a fortress of spreadsheets and revenue charts, leaving her as the emotional compass of their home. Whenever he was stressed by some imminent market crash or an unexpected lawsuit, she soothed him with quiet conversation or an aromatic home-cooked meal dishes she had learned from her grandmother's well-worn recipe book. Yet, there was a fundamental difference between them in how they experienced joy and how they defined success. For Richard, success meant forging forward, conquering new horizons, amassing more wealth, and showcasing his accomplishments to the world. For Helen, it meant seeing the small wonders in each day, a surprising shade of pink in a winter sky, a heartfelt thank you from a student who loved painting, an intimate moment of laughter over a cup of tea on a lazy Sunday. Their marriage was built on respect, but the chasm between their worldviews kept widening. When Helen longed for a simple weekend getaway upstate, Richard preferred lavish jaunts to Bermuda, surrounded by influential clients who could double as vacation companions. When Helen spoke about doing more to help local community centers, Richard touted his philanthropic efforts at black tie galas, often overshadowing her quiet approach. He wasn't cruel, just indifferent to nuances that weren't measured in numbers. That indifferent focus would eventually become his downfall, but for now, it merely brewed quietly in the background of their life. From the moment Richard Davenport stepped onto Wall Street's storied trading floors, he was enthralled by the orchestral chaos of ringing bells, shouting brokers, and flashing screens. It was there he discovered that finance was less about spreadsheets and more about human psychology, knowing when fear or greed would drive the markets. By the time he hit 30, he'd multiplied his initial investments tenfold. His hedge fund, Davenport Equity Management, was known for aggressive bets that often paid off and occasionally flirted with disaster. What drew many to Richard was his magnetic charm and ability to make the most complex financial concept seem intuitive. Some described him as a corporate politician, someone who knew exactly how to navigate the personalities of both high-net-worth investors and everyday employees. He was a master at bridging gaps, at forging alliances that made him indispensable. Yet, beneath that polished exterior lay a deep-rooted insecurity that propelled him forward. Having come from a modest background, he constantly feared losing the status he'd worked so hard to attain. If a peer in finance announced a new venture, Richard would often lose sleep strategizing how to outdo it. If an acquaintance purchased a grand estate, Richard would quietly look into acquiring something even more impressive, much like a champion determined never to relinquish his title. This relentless drive did yield philanthropic gestures, endowing scholarships at Harvard, donating to arts programs for disadvantaged youth, but critics whispered these were more about burnishing an already illustrious reputation. In private, Helen would remind him that philanthropic work meant genuine altruism. He would hold her hand, give an indulgent smile, and say, "Of course," before swiftly shifting to another conversation about potential mergers or expansions. It wasn't that he was incapable of compassion, it was that progress and prestige consumed him. Gradually, Helen recognized that Richard's avalanche of business dinners and late-night deals wasn't merely about the job. He was addicted to the adrenaline rush of constant acquisition. And that addiction left him vulnerable in ways he never expected. He cultivated new relationships everywhere, both personal and professional, without always examining whether they were truly beneficial or secretly malignant. And so, as the months drifted by, Richard's empire expanded. His name was etched into the donor walls of multiple museums and universities, while pictures of the Davenports appeared in glossy magazines covering their charity soirees. No one noticed the subtle tectonic shifts that were leading him away from the wife who had once grounded him. In fact, even Helen only saw the cracks when it was too late, and by then an alluring force had already embedded itself in their lives. Cindy Marlowe arrived in New York with a single suitcase, a small stash of savings, and a determination to rise above her provincial origins in rural Virginia. For her entire adolescence, she'd heard the siren call of bright lights and big opportunities that New York seemed to promise in movies and magazines. She had grown up watching her mother juggle menial jobs, sometimes relying on the goodwill of neighbors for groceries. While those years were humbling, they forged in Cindy a sharp awareness of what beauty could do in a world that revered wealth. By her early 20s, she had perfected a persona of effortless charm. She practiced gliding into a room, always scanning for the wealthiest man present. She did not consider herself a heartless schemer, rather. She saw it as survival of the fittest in an unforgiving city. Cindy never bothered with illusions of romance or genuine love. Her experiences taught her that relying on emotion left one vulnerable. After a brief stint waitressing in a dingy diner, Cindy found work as a hostess at an upscale lounge on Madison Avenue. This new environment felt more like home, a place where affluent men, flush with cash, came to unwind. She learned how to speak just enough about finance or real estate to pique their interest. She learned how to laugh at jokes she found boring or to feign curiosity about topics that meant nothing to her. Tips came her way in crisp $100 bills, and invitations to exclusive events followed soon after. With each new acquaintance, she compiled a mental ledger of potential opportunities. Over time, she struck gold with a few short-lived affairs with men who were either too emotionally detached to suspect her motives or too infatuated to care. And every time these relationships fizzled, Cindy emerged with new knowledge about how to manipulate her next target. She had heard stories of Richard Davenport's success. His picture graced financial magazines. Rumors circulated about his meticulous approach to business deals, his swaggering confidence, and crucially, his marriage to a graceful but soft-spoken woman. Cindy sensed an opening. A man of Richard's stature, with an arguably more reserved wife, might be susceptible to the right touch of flattery. So when she learned about a charity gala at the Waldorf Astoria in support of childhood art education, an event the Davenports were certain to attend, Cindy positioned herself to intercept him like a hunter eyeing her prey. Manhattan's high society events were notorious for their pageantry, and the gala at the Waldorf Astoria was no exception. The hotel's famous Park Avenue lobby, with its gilded clock tower and elegant marble columns, glistened under the lights. Guests, adorned in luxury ensembles, sipped champagne and exchanged guarded pleasantries. Helen and Richard arrived arm in arm, wearing a well-practiced ease. She wore a tasteful emerald gown that complemented her tawny hair, while he exuded confidence in a custom-fitted tuxedo. The mood was festive as donors and artists mingled, discussing their shared passion for fostering creativity in underserved communities. Reporters from local lifestyle magazines jotted notes about the Davenports, excited to capture the philanthropic couple's contributions. Helen moved smoothly through the crowd, speaking with artists, ensuring they felt supported. Richard, for his part, gravitated toward fellow financiers to talk about how arts could be an investment in cultural capital. Their synergy impressed everyone who witnessed it, at least on the surface. In a corner of the grand ballroom stood Cindy, sipping a glass of sparkling water. She wore a crimson gown that flattered her figure, drawing gazes from across the room. She had gained entry to this invite-only event through a patron she'd been briefly involved with, and she had one objective: meet Richard Davenport. She studied him from afar, noting the confident gestures, the way people gravitated toward him, the admiration in his wife's eyes. All the more enticing for Cindy, taking something so cherished added an extra thrill. Helen, radiant but slightly fatigued from mingling, momentarily stepped away to greet a sculptor she had sponsored. That was the opening Cindy needed. The hostess-turned-seductress approached Richard and politely introduced herself as someone who had long admired his philanthropic efforts. Richard, ever gracious, offered a polite smile. At first, the conversation felt innocuous. She mentioned an interest in launching a small initiative that combined entrepreneurial mentorship with arts funding, a perfect alignment with Davenport Equity's philanthropic brand. It sounded plausible, though faintly rehearsed. Richard, not yet suspicious, listened with mild interest. Her pitch flattered him, highlighting his achievements in a manner that Helen rarely did. Helen's compliments were genuine but simple, sometimes understated, whereas Cindy laid them on thick: his brilliance, his generosity, the wonder of his rise from humble origins. The enchantment was swift. By the end of the night, they exchanged business cards, with Richard suggesting she contact his office. A part of him dismissed the encounter as fleeting, but a darker corner of his mind was intrigued. She was captivating in a way that stoked his pride. He rationalized that providing her professional guidance wouldn't hurt. But as the evening drew to a close, a slight sense of unease nagged at him. It manifested only briefly in his subconscious, drowned by the night's success and the celebratory toast he shared with Helen. A week after the gala, Cindy executed her next move. She composed a carefully worded email, thanking Richard for his time and hinting at her gratitude for any insight he could offer her project. She kept it formal enough to avoid suspicion should Helen or an assistant read it, yet personal enough to catch Richard's eye. She signed off with a gentle, looking forward to learning from the best. Richard, at first, merely forwarded the email to Caroline, his extremely efficient assistant, asking her to schedule a short consultation. Yet the more he thought about Cindy's pitch, the more he found himself curious about her. Could she be the next rising star in the philanthropic world, or was she simply someone hungry for easy attention? Rationalizing that it was purely a business courtesy, he decided to meet with her personally. Over the course of 2 weeks, Richard turned down or rescheduled smaller meetings at Davenport Equity to accommodate a few casual lunches with Cindy. They initially discussed potential philanthropic projects, then segued into Cindy's personal journey, her struggles, her ambitions, and her yearning to create meaningful societal impact. She painted herself as a woman who had overcome adversity to arrive in New York, and her sincerity, or her performance of it, rang true to Richard's ear. He admired the spark in her eyes, the quickness of her mind, and the endless praise she showered on him. He told himself it was exhilarating to be around someone who hung on his every word. Cindy allowed him to take on the role of mentor, and she reveled in it. She asked him to walk her through the labyrinth of philanthropic boards, to detail how financial statements were best used to encourage donors, and how to position a new program for maximum impact. She laughed at his jokes. She lightly touched his hand when making a point. She introduced subtle personal anecdotes that hinted at her lonely upbringing and lack of guidance, nudging Richard to fulfill that paternal or protective role. Within a month, these lunches became dinners. Cindy found reasons to choose quieter, candlelit restaurants on the Upper West Side, far from the typical circuit of Richard's business associates. Wine flowed, conversations became more personal, and lines blurred. Cindy confessed she had never felt so seen before by a powerful man. Richard, flattered, explained that he rarely encountered someone as driven as she was. In truth, he was drifting into an emotional affair, rationalizing it as professional mentorship. But both he and Cindy knew that professional boundaries were crumbling fast. Helen was not blind to the subtle changes in her husband. She noticed his phone lighting up at odd hours. She recognized the new cologne he'd started wearing, a brand she hadn't gifted him. She observed how he frequently claimed to have late meetings or last-minute dinners with potential donors. An uneasy feeling grew in her mind, especially whenever she caught a whiff of a perfume that wasn't hers lingering on Richard's jackets. Still, Helen resisted jumping to conclusions. She'd never known Richard to stray before, and she wondered if maybe the pressure of new ventures at Davenport Equity was causing his restless behavior. She tried discussing it with her confidant, Victoria Lance, a fellow philanthropist who often collaborated on art education events. Over coffee at Serendipity, a whimsical dessert spot on East 60th Street, Helen confided, "I sense a distance in Richard. I can't put my finger on it, but something's changed." Victoria, a worldly woman with a philanthropic background of her own, studied Helen carefully. "Marriages go through phases," she offered gently. "Sometimes the spark just dims temporarily." Yet the concern in her eyes revealed she suspected more than just a dimming spark. She urged Helen to keep a watchful eye on financial statements, credit card bills, and any unusual scheduling changes. Unwilling to become a paranoid spouse, Helen tried to brush away her darker suspicions. Instead, she approached Richard, suggesting a romantic weekend in the Hamptons where the two could relax and reconnect. He seemed receptive, but never confirmed a date, citing unpredictable business obligations. "It's just not a good time," he insisted, with a pained expression that Helen found puzzling. She tried to reassure him that she only wanted to help him distress, but he waved it off, saying, "We'll go soon, I promise." Helen did not want to accuse him of an affair without proof, or even to mention her suspicions. So she waited quietly, trusting that love and honesty would prevail. A part of her believed she and Richard would overcome whatever this was, just another bump in a life that had otherwise been blessed. But the gnawing doubt remained, a small but relentless burr lodged in her heart. For Richard and Cindy, what started as flirtation cascaded into a fully fledged affair. Cindy possessed a talent for seduction, meticulously planned. She would text him during critical board meetings with carefully cropped selfies showing her elegant outfits. "Thinking of you," she wrote, adding winking emojis that made Richard's pulse quicken. When Richard traveled for business to Boston or Chicago, she found ways to appear at the same hotel, claiming she was simply in the area for a women's conference. Inevitably, they'd end up in each other's arms. Richard felt the moral weight of his actions, especially in quiet moments when he glanced at Helen's photographs on the mantel in their townhouse. Yet the allure of Cindy's attention, her flattery, and the potent cocktail of lust and validation proved addictive. He kept telling himself that once the excitement wore off, he could quietly let it fade and return to normalcy with Helen. The guilt he carried was subdued by the thrill he felt each time Cindy told him, "You're extraordinary," or "I've never known anyone like you." Behind the scenes, Cindy was carefully orchestrating her future. She pushed Richard to buy her expensive gifts, either as spontaneous tokens of affection or under the guise of business needs. She ended her job at the lounge, claiming it no longer aligned with her philanthropic aspirations. Richard, enthralled, offered her a consulting role with a monthly stipend paid under a shell company associated with Davenport Equity Management. Cindy's life became an opulent parade of brand-new designer outfits from Prada or Dolce & Gabbana, gourmet meals, and a luxe Soho apartment. Every corner of it was funded by Richard's generosity. Meanwhile, at home, Helen watched the credit card bills. She noticed new charges in Cindy's neighborhoods, though no official name was attached. When she politely questioned Richard, he brushed it off as business expenses or client entertainment. The tension grew, and with each explanation, Helen's trust eroded. She began suspecting that she might be living with a man she no longer fully knew. One chilly morning in late November, Helen woke early, unable to sleep after another late return from Richard the previous night. She decided to brew a pot of tea and review household paperwork bills, staff payroll, upcoming philanthropic events. In sifting through a stack of envelopes, she stumbled across an unfamiliar receipt from Van Cleef and Arpels, dating to a week prior. The item in question, an exorbitantly priced piece of jewelry, but she had received no such gift, and no mention of it had been made to her. A cold wave of realization washed over Helen. This was not mere financial oversight. It was likely evidence of a deeper betrayal. She felt shaky, torn between heartbreak and anger. Her mind swirled with questions. Who did he buy this for? How could he betray me like this? What does this mean for our marriage? Before confronting Richard, she decided to seek professional advice. In a quiet phone call, she contacted Nathan King, a private investigator renowned for his discretion. She provided him the bare minimum: times, receipts, suspicious changes in Richard's schedule. Nathan listened without judgment, noting down every detail. He assured her he would proceed with utmost care, blending into the city's currents without alerting anyone, especially Richard. Over the next weeks, Nathan methodically trailed Richard's movements. He captured photographs of clandestine hotel rendezvous between Richard and Cindy, documented suspicious expense receipts, and even managed to snap a few images of Cindy entering Richard's chauffeured town car. His report, delivered to Helen in a sealed envelope, offered incontrovertible proof of the affair. Heart-pounding, Helen flipped through each photograph. There it was, her husband, leaning in to kiss a striking young redhead. The time and date were stamped on the corner. The black and white stills turned her worst suspicions into an undeniable fact. Grief and fury welled up, but she refused to break down. In her mind, a new clarity emerged. If their marriage was to have any future, Richard's deception had to end. And if it couldn't be saved, she needed to protect herself from the avalanche of consequences his betrayal might bring. From Cindy's perspective, the affair was blossoming into precisely what she had always sought: a pathway to immense power and wealth. Yet she soon grew impatient. The monthly allowances were generous but ephemeral. She set her sights on something bigger: marriage to Richard Davenport. Why settle for being an accessory when she could become the wife of a millionaire? In intimate moments, she would drop suggestive remarks about families and futures. She'd hint at how she wanted someone stable to build a legacy with. Richard caught up in the romantic haze, would nod along, though a flicker of guilt always stopped him from agreeing wholeheartedly. He was a married man after all, and as much as he complained to Cindy about the distance in his marriage, he couldn't bring himself to blow up his life that dramatically. But Cindy was nothing if not resourceful. She studied Helen's public persona, her philanthropic engagements, her background in art, her gentle approach to social interactions. Cindy told herself Helen was a soft obstacle, easily pushed aside once pressure was applied. She believed that Helen lacked the cunning or the ferocity to fight back. Cindy planned to accelerate matters by making sure Richard saw only her unwavering devotion and Helen's supposed insignificance. When that didn't result in the immediate ring on her finger that she expected, Cindy resolved to up the ante. She nudged Richard into attending more public events with her under the pretext of philanthropic synergy. Sometimes she managed to do so under an alias or by claiming they were co-hosts for a potential new foundation. If Richard balked, she'd turn distant, a tactic that always pulled him back in. As weeks passed, her demands grew. She pressed him to fund a new non-profit in her name, to buy a larger condo, to introduce her to more of his high-powered contacts. Each time, Richard complied to some degree, rationalizing it as a philanthropic or business arrangement. But it was only a matter of time before those who surrounded him, his employees, business associates, and above all, his wife, recognized that something was terribly amiss. Deeply wounded, Helen bided her time before confronting Richard. She wanted a moment that was private, but she also wanted to be fully prepared, armed with evidence that left him no room for lies. So one night, after he returned from a supposed client dinner, she asked him to join her in the townhouse's drawing room. The golden glow of the table lamp illuminated the tension etched on their faces. She laid out the photographs, the receipts, the text logs she had gleaned from phone records. There was no need for dramatics. The evidence spoke volumes. Richard turned white as he flipped through the images. He attempted to deny it at first, but quickly realized there was no point in pretense. Eyes lowered, he offered a torrent of apologies, explaining that he had made a horrible mistake, that it was never about replacing Helen, that he still loved her deeply. Helen's voice shook with fury and heartbreak. "When did you decide I wasn't enough?" she asked, tears brimming in her eyes. "I stood by you all these years, Richard. I believed in you, championed you, defended you. Was that meaningless to you?" Tears gathered at the corners of his own eyes, though whether from genuine remorse or fear of consequences, Helen couldn't be sure. He tried to assure her that he would end it with Cindy immediately, that he would prove his loyalty. In desperation, he reached for Helen's hands. She pulled away, reeling from the weight of his betrayal. "I want answers," Helen said quietly. "I want to know how long this has gone on, what your plans were, if you intended to leave me for her." He insisted that he had no such intention, that it was merely a lapse in judgment fueled by vanity and stress. He invoked their history, the love they'd once shared, the marriage vows they'd taken. Through tears, Helen told him to leave her alone that night. She needed space to decide whether their marriage could be salvaged or if it was irreparably broken. Richard found himself sleeping in the guest suite, consumed by shame and uncertainty. For the first time, he understood that his empire, both personal and professional, teetered on the edge of collapse. And though he didn't yet know it, the real chaos was about to ensue because Cindy would never let him go quietly. Cindy's phone chimed incessantly that following afternoon, a staccato of calls, texts and voicemails. She picked up her phone with an irritated sigh, irritated that Richard was flooding her with messages ending their affair so curtly. He wrote that he was ending their relationship, that he needed to fix his marriage, that they should cease all contact. His final text, "This is over. I am sorry. Do not contact me again." Blindsided, Cindy flew into a rage. She had not invested so much time and effort into Richard Davenport just to be thrown aside like an unwanted accessory. Her mind leaped to the potential weapons in her arsenal: intimate photos, text messages, recorded voicemails referencing hush-hush deals, or personal confessions Richard had made about strategic expansions that might damage his company if exposed. The threat of going public with such details was strong leverage. Without hesitation, she dialed his number. No answer. She tried again. Still nothing. In a scathing text, she threatened to leak everything if he dared discard her without compensation. "You owe me," she wrote, "and if you won't pay up, I'll make you regret it." For a few hours, Richard remained silent, grappling with how to handle this new threat. He was well aware that a public scandal could devastate his reputation, cause stockholders to panic, and shatter any chance of reconciliation with Helen. Although blackmail from Cindy was a nightmare scenario, he couldn't be surprised he knew, at least subconsciously, that she was capable of such an approach. Finally, Richard consulted with Thomas Carlyle, his longtime attorney and a friend from Harvard Law School. Thomas advised him that if Cindy's demands escalated, they might have legal grounds for an extortion case. But it wouldn't be a clean fight. Mud would be slung, and any attempts to hush her might add weight to her potential claims. Thomas strongly suggested that Richard involve Helen, or at least keep her informed about the next steps. "This is no time for half measures," Thomas warned. "You're dealing with a woman who has nothing to lose. She could destroy everything." Helen had always been mild-mannered, more comfortable painting sunlit streetscapes than entering into battles of wits. But the discovery of Richard's affair awakened a sense of preservation and cunning she never knew she possessed. When Richard finally mustered the courage to tell her about Cindy's blackmail threats, Helen did not lose her composure. Instead, she calmly told him, "We'll handle it together for now." She contacted her own lawyer, an old family acquaintance named Penelope Sangster, a woman famed for her razor-sharp negotiation tactics in high-profile divorce cases. Though Helen had yet to commit to a divorce, she needed to know her rights and how to shield herself from any fallout. She and Penelope pored over financial documents, analyzing which assets were in Richard's name, which were co-owned, and which could be repositioned swiftly. In the process, Helen learned just how extensive Davenport Equity's finances were and how vulnerable Richard might be if Cindy took her threats to the press. Penelope, intrigued by Helen's determination, posed an option. "Would you consider repositioning certain holdings under your name or in trust? A defensive strategy, in case the media storms in." Helen found the notion both empowering and disconcerting. She wanted to save her marriage if that was still possible, but she wouldn't walk into a potential scandal unprotected. After considerable deliberation, she authorized a series of legal measures to transfer portions of the real estate holdings and investment accounts into her name, quietly and efficiently. Meanwhile, Helen directed a private detective to dig deeper into Cindy's background. If Cindy believed she had leverage, Helen would ensure she had leverage of her own. The results arrived a week later. Cindy had a well-documented pattern of dating affluent men and extracting money through dubious means. There was even a recorded complaint in California from a businessman who accused her of financial entrapment, though it never went to trial. Reading these findings, Helen felt both pity and revulsion. However, it gave her the ammunition she needed. So she arranged a private meeting with Cindy, one that would change the power dynamic entirely. The venue for their confrontation was a sleek conference room at the Davenport Equity Management Building on Park Avenue, a calculated choice. It was a place where Cindy would feel Richard's authority, but also be reminded that Helen, not Richard, had requested this meeting. Cindy arrived dressed in a fitted black dress, her hair perfectly styled, her expression tense but resolute. Helen waited calmly at the long glass table, flanked by Penelope Sangster and a retired judge who served as a neutral legal consultant. The setting was designed to intimidate, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan's skyline, subdued lighting that emphasized every tension in the air. When Cindy entered, her eyes darted around, but she quickly regained composure. "I assume Richard is running late?" she asked, sarcasm dripping in her tone. Helen spoke instead, her voice controlled. "He's not coming. This is between you and me." She gestured for Cindy to take a seat. Cindy's gaze flitted over to Penelope and the retired judge, her confidence wavering. Helen slid a folder across the table. Inside, Cindy found evidence not only of her affair with Richard, but also her past involvement with other wealthy men photographs. Statements, even hush-hush settlements. Her hands trembled. She didn't think anyone could have dug so deeply into her personal history. Calmly, Helen explained the situation. If Cindy pursued blackmail or leaked salacious details, Helen would unleash a legal onslaught that would highlight Cindy's pattern of extortion. Cindy could face criminal charges. Her name would be forever tarnished, her manipulations laid bare in front of any future target. The retired judge nodded solemnly, affirming that the legal ramifications would be dire. Cindy's shock melted into anger, but she recognized the checkmate. All her bravado, her hold over Richard, collapsed under the weight of Helen's revelations. For a moment, she considered storming out, but the threat of immediate legal action kept her in her seat. "What do you want from me?" Cindy spat through clenched teeth. Helen remained poised. "I want you to disappear from our lives. You'll sign a binding non-disclosure agreement, forfeiting any claim on Richard. In exchange, I'll approve a modest settlement to ensure you don't starve. But it won't be the jackpot you envisioned." Penelope slid over the NDA, detailing that any breach would result in immediate legal action, including the release of all evidence. Cindy scanned it with contempt, knowing she had no bargaining chips left. She whispered profanities under her breath, but eventually, with shaking fingers, she signed. Helen rose, collected the folder, and gazed at Cindy one last time. "If you defy these terms," she said, her voice ice-cold, "know that I will protect what's mine, without mercy." Cindy felt a chill crawl up her spine. She had never believed Helen was capable of such ruthlessness. But she realized now, too late, that she had been outplayed by the very woman she once deemed too meek to fight back. In the days following the boardroom showdown, Cindy vanished from Richard's life. No more texts, no more brazen appearances. The arrangement Helen had orchestrated locked Cindy behind a fortress of legal intimidation. She retreated to a smaller apartment in Queens, seething, but pinned down by the threat of lawsuits and her diminished resources. While she still had a modest settlement, it was nothing compared to the fortune she once believed awaited her. Richard, meanwhile, attempted to mend his marriage. He begged Helen for forgiveness, proposing couples therapy, promising to be transparent in all financial dealings, even volunteering to place more assets in her name if it would ease her fears. He ended any illusions of maintaining contact with Cindy, not even responding to her final venomous messages. For a while, it looked like they might find a fragile path to reconciliation, but Helen's heart remained guarded. While she appreciated Richard's newfound willingness to do anything for their marriage, the betrayal left scars. She found herself unable to laugh with him as she once did, or to slip effortlessly into his arms. Intimacy became strained. Late at night, she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if trust could ever truly be restored. Yet she chose to endure, at least temporarily, in part because she wanted closure on her own terms. Whether that meant truly forgiving Richard or gathering the strength to leave him, she wasn't yet certain. So they coexisted in an uneasy truce, he anxious to prove his remorse, she quietly calculating her next steps. Despite his pledge to be an open book, Richard still had secrets. He desperately tried to compartmentalize the aftermath of the affair, hoping it would fade if he overcompensated with good behavior. But Cindy refused to remain a mere ghost of his past. She lingered in his thoughts, occasionally texting cryptic messages that implied she might reappear in his life. Terrified of provoking Helen's wrath, Richard answered none of them, yet he also failed to delete them from his phone. Helen, meanwhile, kept a watchful eye on his phone records. She spotted an unlisted number, sending him messages late at night. Though he never replied, seeing them triggered her anxiety. It seemed like the final betrayal, even if he was not actively responding. Why hadn't he told her about the messages? Why hide them? Did a part of him still want to keep that door ajar? Their arguments grew frequent, sometimes sparked by the smallest misunderstandings. Helen questioned every unexplained phone call, every unplanned business lunch. Richard grew defensive, claiming he was doing everything he could to rebuild trust. In truth, their marriage began fraying again, undone by residual secrets and unspoken hurts. In one particularly heated confrontation, Helen discovered that Richard had purchased an expensive bracelet from Cartier, supposedly to celebrate the new beginning in their marriage. But she recognized it as the same design once admired by Cindy at a charity event months ago, a detail Richard likely forgot. Helen's face darkened with rage. "Are you giving me her dreams?" she shouted, tossing the jewelry back at him. With that, a wave of final disillusionment washed over them both. Privately, Helen consulted Penelope once more, torn between trying to salvage the marriage and wanting to break free from the constant sense of betrayal. Penelope reminded her that the legal scaffolding they'd set up already provided Helen substantial control over certain assets, including partial stakes in Davenport Equity Management. If divorce was on the table, Helen could push for a settlement that awarded her a controlling share. On the advice of Penelope, Helen started formalizing more of her involvement in the firm's philanthropic wing. She signed documents that made her co-chair of certain committees, overseer of specific funds, until eventually she had enough weight within Davenport Equity Management to influence board decisions. Richard, blinded by his desperation to seem trustworthy, allowed this with minimal hesitation. He believed it would prove his willingness to be transparent. But as he placed more power in her hands, a quiet shift began. Simultaneously, Helen found comfort in her painting, throwing herself into a series of pieces that depicted turbulent seas, lonely figures standing at crossroads. She also expanded her philanthropic work, championing scholarships for young artists who lacked resources. The positive feedback she received in those arenas contrasted starkly with the tension she felt at home. Unbeknownst to Richard, Helen was also consulting a financial forensic expert, ensuring that if the time came for a formal separation, she would know precisely where every asset was stored. She did not do this out of greed, but out of self-protection. She had seen firsthand how easily illusions of security could shatter when built on lies. Perhaps Richard still believed that he could juggle half-truths, but the reality was that any further slip would detonate the remains of his marriage. And slip he did. One afternoon, Helen intercepted a phone call from a boutique medical clinic inquiring about insurance coverage for a prenatal appointment under the name Cindy Marlowe Davenport. The confusion on the clinic's end suggested that Cindy had told them to bill Richard's insurance. Helen's heart pounded in her ears. Was Cindy pregnant with Richard's child? Did Richard know? The receptionist apologized for the confusion and hung up, leaving Helen reeling. She confronted Richard that evening with the clinic's note in hand. He was dumbstruck, claiming he had no idea. When pressed, he admitted that Cindy had recently texted him, implying she might be pregnant, but he hadn't believed her. This revelation was the final straw. Though no conclusive evidence existed that Cindy was truly pregnant, she might be fabricating it for leverage. Helen no longer cared about verifying details. The fact that Richard had kept the possibility hidden from her once again illustrated that he was incapable of full honesty. In that moment, the fragile bond they had been clinging to snapped completely. Helen quietly left the room, tears streaming down her cheeks. That night, she made up her mind. Their marriage was over, and she would wield every legal tool she had amassed to ensure that she emerged with her dignity and the empire they had built together firmly in her hands. When Helen served Richard with divorce papers, it sent shockwaves through Manhattan's elite circles. After all, the Davenports had been held up as an ideal power couple, philanthropists, patrons of the arts, and shining examples of success. Publications like Page 6 and Business Insider swiftly picked up the story, Richard Davenport and wife. Helen Davenport headed for Splitsville. Headlines ran wild with speculation rumors about the Mistress, the alleged pregnancy, and the tension behind the closed doors of their townhouse. Richard was stunned, though a part of him had known this day was inevitable. The court summons outlined that Helen sought not only a divorce on grounds of infidelity, but also requested spousal support, substantial alimony, and a division of their entire estate. More terrifyingly, the documents revealed that she possessed majority control in certain areas of Davenport equity management, a fact Richard had overlooked while attempting to appease her. He tried to negotiate privately, inviting her to counseling, offering more transparency, even suggesting that they separate amicably without going nuclear. But Helen's ultimatum was firm. The time for apologies was over. She wanted a clean break, and she would take what was hers. The legal proceedings were swift. Despite Richard's attempts to fight, Helen's strategic transfer of assets and ironclad legal arrangements left him cornered. His lawyers were forced to strike settlement deals that heavily favored her, awarding her property rights to the townhouse, their Hamptons estate, and control over significant portions of Davenport equity. Investors, spooked by the unfolding drama, questioned whether Richard was stable enough to continue running the firm. The board of directors began whispering about a leadership transition. To complicate matters, Cindy, whose alleged pregnancy remained unconfirmed, resurfaced on social media with veiled references to unfair betrayals, fueling the rumor mill. Yet, her NDA barred her from directly naming the Davenports, so her cryptic posts only stirred more speculation. This media circus further tarnished Richard's standing, placing him under intense scrutiny from both regulators and shareholders. Cindy Marlowe soon discovered that her illusions of landing in the lap of luxury had backfired in spectacular fashion. Though she received a modest monthly stipend as part of Helen's settlement, the money came in regulated disbursements tied to a strict set of conditions in the non-disclosure agreement. She could not speak to the press. She could not publish a tell-all. She could not approach Richard or request additional funds without prior authorization from the legal team. Any violation would see her meager settlement withheld. Her once lavish Soho apartment was already vacated due to unpaid bills. Mired in bitterness, she moved to a small studio in Queens. She took a job as a receptionist in a mid-range spa, far from the glitz of the Madison Avenue lounge where she'd once held court. She detested the monotony and the humbling reality of having to answer to a supervisor. Meanwhile, the circles she had frequented during her affair with Richard closed their doors to her. People who had once welcomed her at society parties now saw her as a dangerous liability. With every new article about the Davenports' divorce, with every rumor, Cindy felt a pang of regret. She was a footnote in a bigger story, overshadowed by Helen's victory and Richard's downfall. Adding insult to injury, Cindy's attempts to catch another high-profile millionaire repeatedly failed. Word traveled fast in exclusive social networks, and few men of influence wished to risk entanglement with someone rumored to peddle blackmail. So she found herself living a smaller life than before, haunted by the knowledge that she had soared so close to the sun, only to crash land in anonymity. As the divorce proceedings came to a close, Helen emerged with a dignity and power that few expected. She maintained the townhouse on East 73rd Street, turned the Hamptons estate into a retreat for her philanthropic activities, and effectively held the reins of Davenport equity through her voting shares. Rather than stepping in as CEO, she appointed a seasoned executive, Melissa Jenkins, who specialized in sustainable and ethical investments. This pivot not only saved the firm from mass exodus, but also gave it a fresh public image, Davenport equity under new vision, as Forbes put it. The transition was rocky. At first, long-time employees loyal to Richard felt uneasy taking orders from Helen, who they perceived as an outsider to the finance world. However, Helen's gentle leadership style, combined with Melissa's expertise, gradually eased tensions. Profits stabilized, and over time, new investors were drawn to the firm's socially conscious approach. The press fawned over Helen, lauding her as a symbol of resilience and empowerment. Her philanthropic background became an asset, bridging finance with community-driven projects. On a personal level, Helen navigated a complex tapestry of emotions. She had lost the man she once loved beyond reason, yet she gained a new sense of self-worth. She refused to let bitterness define her, choosing instead to pour her heart into philanthropic work and her art. In the townhouse's top-floor studio, she created a series of paintings that portrayed transformation, soft watercolors blending into bold strokes, capturing the moment when gloom gave way to light. Friends marveled at her grace, while some marveled at the ferocity she had shown when cornered. It was never about revenge, she once told Victoria Lance over tea. I had to protect myself, my future. Betrayal doesn't mean your life ends. Sometimes it's a new beginning. Richard struggled to pick up the pieces. After Helen's settlement, his personal wealth dwindled to a fraction of its former size. Although he still had enough to live comfortably, his once dominant presence in the firm vanished, replaced by a stigma that made investors wary. He moved to a smaller penthouse in Midtown, where he nursed his wounded pride. Exiled from the firm he had built, he tried starting a boutique investment advisory, but found that potential clients were cautious, citing concerns about the negative press swirling around his name. Some old friends still invited him to dinners or tried to show support, but the majority distanced themselves. Not wanting to be tainted by scandal, he remained under the watchful eye of the media. Occasionally, paparazzi snapped photos of him entering or leaving restaurants alone, fueling speculation about how far he had fallen from his once glorious position. In the darkest hours, he would stare at the city lights, remembering how unstoppable he once felt. The memory was as painful as it was nostalgic, a constant reminder that arrogance and betrayal had cost him everything. Though therapy was suggested by a few concerned acquaintances, Richard resisted initially, unwilling to confront his own failings. Only after several months of isolation did he admit that he needed help to navigate the wreckage of his life. Under the guidance of a discreet therapist, he began to unpack the choices that led him to ruin. Whether he would fully redeem himself remained uncertain, but at least he started acknowledging the role his vanity and selfishness played in the destruction of his marriage. Cindy's downward spiral was equally harsh, if less public. She couldn't rely on blackmail or leaks to the tabloids. Helen's legal net was too tight. Her modest stipend barely covered rent and essential expenses, forcing her to downgrade her lifestyle piece by piece. The frustration boiled over in fits of anger at work, leading her to lose her receptionist job. She took on bartending at a small lounge near Times Square, a far cry from the glamorous establishments she once inhabited. Periodically, she'd see a news report about Helen's philanthropic success or read an article celebrating Davenport Equity's new direction. Each mention reminded her of what might have been if she'd managed to outmaneuver Helen or if she had chosen a different path. A sense of shame gnawed at her, but so did resentment. She felt the world had been unfair, that it had favored the respectable wife over the cunning mistress. One evening, after a draining shift, Cindy scrolled through photos on her phone, souvenirs of her fling with Richard. Once, these had felt like trophies, proof that she had seduced one of the city's most powerful men. Now, they were relics of a life she'd lost, an empire that never truly belonged to her. She briefly considered approaching some tabloid for a final big payday, but the NDA threatened catastrophic legal action if she dared. And so, Cindy accepted the grinding reality of her day-to-day existence. Her illusions of grandeur reduced to a footnote in a story that ended with Helen's triumph. Months turned into a year, and Helen found herself reflecting on how drastically life could change in such a short span. In many ways, her divorce freed her to become a more authentic version of herself. She took on a bigger role in shaping Davenport Equity's philanthropic mission, focusing on sustainable ventures and community outreach. Her name occasionally appeared in business columns, lauding her quiet but impactful leadership style. On a more personal level, she traveled abroad for the first time without Richard, spending several weeks in Tuscany, painting rolling hillsides and golden sunsets. She found solace and inspiration there, her creative impulses flourishing amid the sun-drenched Italian countryside. The trip felt like a healing pilgrimage. She left behind the heartbreak that had dominated the past year and returned to New York, rejuvenated, more certain of her identity and purpose. Helen also deepened her involvement with art education, establishing a foundation in her own name, the Helen Davenport Arts and Empowerment Fund, which provided scholarships for young, underprivileged artists. Seeing the sparkle in a student's eyes when they realized someone believed in their talent reminded Helen of her own journey, from a humble upbringing in Queens to a life of unimaginable wealth and adversity. Victoria Lance, her steadfast friend, congratulated her on each achievement, reminding her that not all triumphs need to be flamboyant. Sometimes the greatest victories, Victoria often mused, are the ones that let us sleep peacefully at night. By the second year post-divorce, the city's gossip machine had mostly moved on to new scandals. Yet, traces of the Davenport drama occasionally resurfaced in whispered conversations or rerun tabloid articles. Helen rarely thought of Cindy, except when a friend mentioned spotting a formerly glamorous redhead now waiting tables. Helen took no joy in Cindy's downfall, but she couldn't deny feeling relieved that Cindy no longer threatened her peace. Richard's attempts to rehabilitate his image yielded mixed results. He launched a smaller investment firm with a handful of loyal clients, though nowhere near the grandeur of Davenport Equity Management. Some said he'd found humility through therapy, expressing regret for his past behavior. Others doubted he'd truly changed, suspecting he was merely biding his time for a grand comeback. Whatever the truth, he seldom crossed paths with Helen anymore. Their shared circles parted like branches of a once thriving tree. Helen felt neither glee nor pity for Richard. She viewed him as a cautionary tale of unbridled ambition undone by personal weakness. Sometimes, after reading about him in a minor business column, she allowed herself a moment of reflection, wondering if he'd finally found the peace he claimed he sought. In her more forgiving moments, she hoped he had. By the time Helen turned 40, she stood at the helm of a small empire of goodwill. Davenport Equity, steered by Melissa Jenkins, remained a powerhouse, and Helen's shares ensured she had final say in major strategic decisions, though she mostly left daily operations to the experts. Instead, Helen's core focus was her philanthropic foundation and her art, endeavors that filled her days with renewed passion. At a gala she hosted at the newly renovated townhouse, Helen showcased not only her own paintings, but also the works of budding artists she sponsored. The event was a heartfelt success, with critics praising her for blending philanthropic aims with genuine artistic merit. News outlets covered it as a testament to her transformation, from loyal wife to powerful philanthropist. Helen Davenport's vision. Toward the end of the evening, Victoria Lance raised a toast to Helen, who teaches us that life can begin anew after betrayal. May her spirit continue to guide us toward compassion and courage. The guests applauded, clinking their glasses in acknowledgement of Helen's grace and strength. In that moment, Helen felt an odd sense of closure. She remembered the heartbreak, the sense of betrayal that once consumed her. Now, those feelings had transformed into a quiet conviction that life is shaped not by the wounds we suffer, but by how we choose to heal and grow afterward. She was proof that even in the face of deceit, a determined heart could shine brighter than any darkness. At every turn, this story has shown that power and wealth offer no shield against the consequences of betrayal. Richard Davenport's drive to conquer the world left him vulnerable to temptation, and Cindy Marlowe's cunning ambition led her into a vicious cycle of manipulation and downfall. In the end, it was Helen Davenport, gentle, principled, and underestimated, who seized control of the empire and found a new identity beyond a broken marriage. Success isn't measured by someone else's ruination, it's measured by personal growth and the courage to protect what truly matters. Helen's ultimate triumph wasn't just financial, it was her ability to stand tall when all illusions had crumbled. Her story is a testament to resilience, proof that actions carry ripples far beyond fleeting temptations. If you found this journey as gripping as it was cautionary, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive and our creative spirit thriving.